Hello to you, 3CI, and hello to Solid Ground in Middleburg, anyone else watching today, and welcome to Reading, England. We're staying with our wonderful friends, the Williams family, and this is their lounge, which we have tried to turn into a studio. We had a moment where we were like, how many regular humans does it take to replicate Ricky LaRue? So we've done our best. We love you so much. We miss 3CI every single day. I'm actually quite relieved that I can't see you guys because I would just sob like a child. It's an absolute joy and privilege for me today to be wrapping up our Megaloth series, these 5 Old Testament books that Rory and Steve have walked us through over the past many weeks: Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Esther, and Ruth. But to do that, I actually want to jump right ahead into the Gospel of John and chapter 15. Jesus says, "I am the true grapevine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit, and he prunes the branches that do bear fruit, so they will produce even more." Verse 4, "Remain in me," some versions say, "abide in me, and I will remain in you. For a branch cannot produce fruit if it is severed from the vine, and you cannot be fruitful unless you remain in me." So hold on to this image of the vine, if you would. Think of it as a continuous tendril of truth growing along the trellis of these 5 books, because in each of these 5 books we find Jesus, this same true grapevine, and we find the Father, the vine dresser. In the grief and hope of Lamentations, God says, "Abide in me." In the search for meaning and purpose that plays out in the book of Ecclesiastes, when all is said and done, God says, "Abide in me." The grand love affair that is Song of Songs, the young woman finds refuge and courage as she abides in her lover. Esther makes a decision that come what may, she will abide in the God who is able to save her nation. Ruth forsakes the comfort of her own culture because she finds a better, deeper comfort abiding in her God. I've struggled to get my head around what abide really means. Like, what does it look like to remain in Jesus? How can I be sure I'm really always attached enough to Jesus to call it proper abiding? I don't know, the way a branch needs to be permanently, deeply affixed to the vine to survive and bear fruit. Because abiding it's surely more than just logging in for long enough to get the download we need and then saying, "Cool, thanks Jesus, I think I'm good to go for the day." Abiding is the ongoing awareness of his presence, even when we don't feel his presence. It's keeping pace with Jesus moment by moment, 5 minutes at a time through our days. You'll see that I've titled this preach "Tender and Flexible," because one commentator notes that the Greek word translated branch, that's us, right? We're the branches connected to the vine. That word branch carries the idea of tenderness and flexibility. Beth Moore writes this. She says, "At the risk of oversimplification, maybe abiding doesn't require deep analysis. Perhaps all I need to ask myself at the moment is whether or not I am still tender, still flexible. At times, I am neither. The branch that snaps easily is either dead or stuck in a long past winter." Jesus didn't call his disciples to cling to the land. He called them to cling to him, even as they went to the far-flung corners of the earth. So this has really helped me because we moved countries 6.5 weeks ago and we don't know yet where we fit. We feel untethered, and that has me feeling like maybe I'm not abiding in the vine. Am I still deeply, irrevocably connected to the source? Have I allowed something to become a tourniquet that's cut off the life supply to me, the branch? It helps me then to ask myself, well, am I still tender, still flexible? And tenderness and flexibility run through these 5 Megaloth books in the most amazing way, and we'll see that in a moment. But another reason I've been thinking a lot about plants and branches and abiding is because one of the prophecies over us as a family in coming here to the UK was that God would use us to change the atmosphere in the new spaces we'd inhabit. And so I've really been praying that because we desperately want to be used. We don't want to waste a moment of our lives. We want Jesus through us to change the atmosphere for his glory wherever we are. And so to remind myself of all of this, I broke off a sprig of a speckworm that was growing in our garden in Fairy Glen, not just because we loved our garden and we wanted to take a little piece of that with us. But because, and I'm sure you know this, the speckworm is a phenomenal carbon sponge. Speckworm means bacon tree. I think maybe because bacon is a vegetable. No, it has nothing to do with bacon. It has a lemony flavor. You can put it in salads. But the real power of the speckworm is that hectare for hectare, a thicket of speckworm is 10 times more effective than the Amazon rainforest at removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So 1 hectare of speckworm can suck up between 4 and 10 tons of carbon emissions per year. It literally changes the atmosphere, and actually a changed atmosphere can change the world. So to remind me that we're here on purpose to make a difference, I wrapped this little sprig of speckworm in some damp tissues inside a Ziploc bag inside my suitcase. I don't know that it was legal, but please, what goes at church stays at church, right? And that little speckworm, tender and flexible as it was, abiding in its damp tissue, survived the flight. I put it in a glass of water on a windowsill. It abided there for a while and grew some roots. A few weeks ago, I planted it in a pot in soil from this English garden on the other side of the world, and it's abiding and thriving in my friend's greenhouse. There should be a picture on your screen. And when we move into our own place in a month, I plan to find a warm, light kitchen windowsill where it can breathe oxygen into our home. See, as long as the branch is abiding, it flourishes. As long as we remain tender and flexible, abiding in a person, not a place, abiding in Jesus, we're all going to be okay. And in Lamentations, so let's start there. The writer describes this person in whom we can abide no matter where we are and no matter what we face. He says this in Lamentations 5:19. But Lord, you remain the same forever. Your throne continues from generation to generation. Take courage, 3CI, solid ground, COVID, building project, all the things. Lord, you remain the same forever. Just this week, we lost a dear friend to cancer. Michelle Simpson, many of you listening, I know, are also mourning her death. And Rory spoke so tenderly about the grief that too many people have experienced in this past traumatic year. I'm recording this on Friday, and it's exactly 1 year today since the start of South Africa's first lockdown. I mean, it has been a year, hasn't it? And you'll remember we saw in Lamentations how right it is to allow grief to run its course. And then comes hope and a future. As Jesus followers, wherever in the world we find ourselves, Pretoria, Middelburg, Durban, Lisbon, Stellenbosch, Reading, let's be tender and flexible, which means there's a time to bend around people's grief, and there's a time to gently take them by the hand and say, it's okay. It's okay to allow yourself to become unstuck, to lift your head and look to the future, because the writer of Lamentations also says in chapter 3, the faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh each morning. So let me just be real with you and say that we have done a lot of grieving over the past many months. So many people said to us, listen, moving countries, it's the hardest thing you will ever do. And I was like, but is it really? I mean, how hard can it be? The answer is very hard, and actually much harder than that. So we've tried to allow ourselves and our sons time to mourn and just feel what we feel and sit with our feelings a little bit. But we're also trying to lift our heads and go, our little speckworm of a family has oxygen yet to breathe into the world. And so do you.
Yes.
I recently came across something called the Stockdale paradox, and just a shout out to my friend Pam who sent me the article. She's listening to this in Armenia. She's there doing physio work for the Red Cross, and she and her team have all contracted COVID. So she's confined to her hotel room, and Pam, we love you and we're praying for you. Admiral James Stockdale was a prisoner of war in Vietnam for 7.5 years. He wrote a memoir about the shocking, diabolical things he experienced there, and yet his later life was happy. Jim Collins interviewed him and was like, how? Collins said, if this memoir feels depressing for me, how on earth did Stockdale survive when he was actually there and did not know the end of the story? Stockdale said this, I never lost faith in the end of the story. I never doubted not only that I would get out, but also that I would prevail in the end and turn the experience into the defining event of my life, which in retrospect, I would not trade. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. We see this very thing in Lamentations. Like, let's not kid ourselves about how hard life is in a broken world. It's very hard, and often even harder than that. But we dare not lose faith in the end of the story. And what sets us apart as a people who abide in the true vine is that we do know how the story ends, and it's glorious. And until we get to that glorious end, we've been promised that just for the next 24 hours, there's enough grace to face a possibly brutal reality. Keep going, 3CI, have faith, confront reality, stay tender, stay flexible. Let's skip back into Ecclesiastes, and I'm going through these books in the order that they were preached, not the order you'll find them in your Bible. In Ecclesiastes, we meet like the original gangster. He tries to party his way to meaning and purpose, and then he's like, wow, that didn't work. He works really hard, reads loads of books. Again, meaningless. Everything we live becomes a story we'll tell, not so. And the writer of Ecclesiastes is like, guys, let me save you some time. Let me tell you some stories I've lived. I wish I had lived them differently. In fact, his closing words in chapter 12 are this. He says, here now is my final conclusion. Fear God and obey his commands. Just abide. Stephen reminded us God's presence is enough. The writer also says, Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 2, he says, after all, God is in heaven and you are here on earth, so let your words be few. We don't always need to have something to say. We don't always need to give our opinions. Tender, flexible. It's my birthday in a few weeks, and some of you may think this is so weird, but my husband bought me a DNA test kit, for the woman who has everything. No, you see, there's a bit of an anthropologist in me. I am fascinated, always have been, by people and where they come from. I'm fascinated by cultures and ancestry and the movement of people across this planet over thousands of years. Like really, I get properly excited about this stuff. Like when I'd meet waiters in restaurants in Pretoria, I would listen to their accents and watch their faces and try and guess if they were from Harare or Bulawayo, like that, okay? And so because my husband knows me so well, plus he's amazing, he ordered this DNA kit for me, and I had to swab the inside of my cheek, and he's hoping the results arrive back from a lab in Denmark around my birthday. Because if Max de Pree is to be believed, I've got some Xhosa blood in me, some Danish, German, Dutch, and English blood in me. And so it will just be a gift to satisfy my curiosity and fascination. Nothing more, nothing less. Because again, when all is said and done, I won't bear fruit in this life because my ancestors came from Scandinavia or East Africa. I will only bear fruit in this life if I abide in Jesus, if my identity is found in Jesus, if my tenderness and flexibility make Jesus irresistible to people who have no idea yet who he has called them to be. Anne Lamott famously said, 100 years from now, all new people. None of us will be here 100 years from now. Ecclesiastes 6 verse 12 says this, in the few days of our meaningless lives, who knows how our days can best be spent? Our lives are like a shadow. Who can tell what will happen on this earth after we are gone? Our lives are so brief, so brief. Don't let that depress you. Let it galvanize you into greater tenderness, greater flexibility. We each get a small cameo role in the eternal blockbuster where Jesus is the main character. This brief moment in which you and I find ourselves in the background chorus on the world stage, it's our time to shine. Let's bear maximum fruit while we can. There is so much here, but we need to move on to Song of Songs. You will remember that Rory pointed out that this book, it's about the love affair between a husband and a wife, God and the church, Jesus and the individual believer. It's filled with garden language, color and fragrance and fruit. The young woman's lover casts shade over her. He protects her from the elements as she abides in him, and her identity is transformed as she accepts that she is deeply, truly loved. In chapter 7, she says this, I am my lover's, and he claims me as his own. And then he calls her out to adventure with him, to abide in him, to stay tender and flexible to his leading. Her past no longer defines her, and her grave language changes to garden language. That's my story. That's your story. Jesus has covered our shame, redefined us, and called us to kingdom adventures. And as we walk through our days abiding in him, we have the opportunity to change grave atmospheres into garden atmospheres. I went walking with my friend Sarah Makumbe this past Saturday. So the UK is still in quite a hard lockdown. You're allowed to go walking with one other person. So Sarah and her husband Blessing are from Urban Life Church. And so we were connected through mutual Urban Life friends. We were probably in the same room at Urban Life on more than one occasion, but we never met there. God saw fit to cross our paths here in Reading. They live a couple miles down the road from where I'm sitting. So I mean, only God, what are the chances of the 7 billion people on the planet? He brings a family from Fairy Glen and a family from Thatchfield and says, now it's time to knit your stories together because I'm doing something. Anyway, I was sharing with Sarah some of the culture shock moments that we've had in the past 6 weeks. And I said to her, but I know we also need to adapt to the culture here. And she said, sure, because there's a time to be all things to all people, to be flexible. But she said to me, are we here to adapt or to influence? I mean, whoa, boom. In the tiny lifespan we've each been given, are we going to just go with the flow? Or might we be brave enough when we encounter grave culture to create garden culture, a culture of tenderness and flexibility that declares to people his banner over you is love? Do people know us for what we are for and not just what we're against? It's asking ourselves, okay, am I just finding fault here or am I seeing a future? I try to ask myself every day and I don't get it right. Does my son need love or a lecture? I mean, lectures are great sometimes. Mostly, I need to bend flexibly around my kids and lean in with tender garden language that says, my banner over you is love. Let's talk about Esther. She's someone who, through abiding in God, makes a choice to influence and not just adapt. You'll remember she's a beautiful Jewish girl, and King Xerxes picks her to be his super sub replacement queen. And so Esther now has the inside track on this foreign culture. Haman, horrid man, he gets promoted over all King Xerxes' nobles and officials. He commands everyone to bow down to him. Mordecai, Esther's family guardian, he refuses, being a God-fearing man. Haman takes this personally, manipulates the king into agreeing to have all the Jews in the empire slaughtered. Mordecai is devastated. He sends a message asking Esther to plead with the king on behalf of her people. Esther says, are you insane? Everyone knows you don't just approach the throne. I mean, how different is that to the king we serve? You don't just approach the throne. That will get you killed. You wait to be summoned. Mordecai sends a reply to Esther, and he says this in Esther 4, verse 13. Don't think for a moment that because you are in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Esther must have felt alone and afraid, walking towards that throne. She must surely have wondered, is this my biggest mistake or my bravest move? But she was abiding. She knew where her real life lay. And so she could say, if I die, I die. Over the past 6 weeks, as a family, we've tried to go back to all the things God said, all the confirmations, because we've wondered, was moving here our biggest mistake or our bravest move? And I've thought of Mordecai's words, like, who knows if perhaps we were put here for just such a time as this? Friends, who knows if perhaps you were put wherever you find yourself for such a time as this? So like every day here, I introduce myself to another mom in the school car park. I'm like, hi, I'm Dalene, Scott's mom. We're fresh off the boat. Please be my friend. I've messaged people saying, hi, I'm not a stalker, but would you like to go for a walk with me? I feel so vulnerable, so exposed. But every time I've mustered up all my brave and reached out to someone, they've all gone, I would love to go for a walk with you. My kids are so excited to meet your kids. Because I think, well, most people feel vulnerable and exposed. And I think that mostly when we try to stay tender and flexible, there's fruit. I keep telling myself, if Esther pushed herself into the uncomfortable space of risking her life before the king, if Jesus pushed himself into the most uncomfortable space imaginable for us, his children, I can really introduce myself to another mom. I can really put myself out there a little more. What's so interesting about the book of Esther is that God's name isn't mentioned once, but he's there all the time. He's orchestrating events to save his people. And maybe you feel like God's name isn't coming up in your story at all at the moment. You feel forgotten. You're out on a limb. You're wondering, like I imagine Esther may have wondered, am I crazy to even be risking this thing? Is this my biggest mistake or my bravest move? What if God's not in this? What if I miss God? I want to say to you, the fact that you're concerned about that means your branch is still tender and flexible. You haven't wrapped the tourniquet of apathy or rebellion around it. It's not like you're going, I just want to do my own thing. No, you want to do God's thing. You're abiding in him. Also, as Lisa Bevere says, it's really hard to miss God because he's a really big target. He's everywhere. And he wouldn't have invited you to follow him if it was impossible to do so. Keep abiding. You are not forgotten. You were born for such a time as this. And the same God who gave Esther favor before the king will grant you favor as you follow him into his purposes for you. Cameron, our oldest son, starts school on Monday. So tomorrow, if you're watching this on Sunday, so I'm going to go ahead and just beg you to pray for him. Scott started school a few weeks ago. Please pray for him too. What has been toughest for him is how much the other kids swear. Like he just cannot get used to it. And one morning, a couple of weeks ago, he was terribly upset about all of this. And God just gave me a picture of a greenhouse. And I said to him, you know what, boy, in a way, you've been used to a greenhouse. And greenhouses are amazing and necessary for plants to take root. Our speckworm needs a greenhouse right now. But actually, God created plants to, at some point, thrive in the wild. And God has seen fit to take you out of the greenhouse and plant you in the wild to change the atmosphere, to thrive and flourish and plant more seeds. And yes, it is unthinkably hard some days, but if we abide, if we stay tender and flexible, there will be fruit. 3CR, we have to remember that God is running this universe and that the world is peripheral to his church, not the other way around. We can't be staying in the greenhouse all our lives. It's good and right that we as the church are planted in the world so that the world can see us bearing the kind of abundant fruit that is beyond rational explanation. Esther lived a story worth telling. So did Ruth. Both women understood that the difficult yes we say to God can feel like a death. But that's the mystery of life in God, isn't it? That death is the doorway of life. That in laying ourselves down, there's resurrection power that leads us into adventure and the fulfillment of God's call on our lives. Both women stepped through fear into faith. And so their stories are worth telling. We're still telling their stories. What strikes me about Ruth is her courage to abide in the God of this family that she's married into, not knowing how the story will end. Her life has been hard. From where she's standing, it might even get harder. God hadn't revealed to her, oh, listen, I know things have been super tough for you. Loads of stuff has gone wrong. But I just want you to know you're going to be named in the lineage of the Messiah. You're welcome. Ruth died not knowing that. She just stays tender and flexible moment by moment. She's not passive, right? She's operating in remarkable countercultural strength by showing kindness, generosity, self-sacrifice. Ruth could have chosen the opposite of tender and flexible. She could have been harsh, stubborn, selfish, arrogant. When her husband died and her mom-in-law moved on, she could have said, "Sucks to be you, Naomi. I'm staying where it's comfortable." Instead, she accepted the vine dresser's pruning of her life. Pruning is painful. Even though we know it's actually for greater growth, when we're in the pruning, it can feel like God is just shrinking us, not growing us. Ruth and Naomi arrive in Bethlehem and they need to eat. So Ruth says to her mom-in-law, "Let me go and collect the scraps of grain left behind by the harvesters." And then we read this in Ruth chapter 2 and verse 3. So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. As it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. And the rest is history. Go back and listen to the Ruth preachers if you missed them. As it happened, she found herself. Where do you find yourself? As it happened, Sarah and Blessing Makumbe live just down the road from us. As it happened, Clint and Ellen connected us with JP and Sharon Kloppers, who live half an hour from us. Clint kept saying, "We have to connect you with these friends of ours. They're from Common Ground in Cape Town. They're amazing. You guys will just get on like a house on fire." So he did connect us, and we were WhatsApping them, and we'd set up a time for a video call on a particular Thursday evening a few months ago when we were still in South Africa. And on that same Thursday morning, a patient of Murray's walked into his practice and she said, "I'm so glad I'm seeing you today. I've been wanting to chat to you. I heard from your mom that you guys are going to England, and I just have to connect you with my son. You guys will get on like a house on fire. His name is JP." So Murray said, "When I speak to him tonight, I'll tell him you say hi. You know, as it happens, as it turned out." Again, what are the chances except that the same God who led Ruth to Boaz's field, he's the same God who lives in us. And like we saw in Lamentations, he remains the same forever. So why would he not do the same for you and for me as we abide in him? And not all our stories can be tied up with the beautiful bows of coincidence, of course not. But if we're abiding in Jesus, we're using a kingdom currency and we're living by a kingdom clock, as a friend of mine says. Ruth was poor. She's eating scraps left in the dirt, but she's trading in a kingdom currency. She's rich. Oh, there's an inheritance here that she can't even imagine. She randomly happens to be in a particular field on a particular day, but her life is really running on a kingdom clock where every encounter is divinely arranged and right on time. Back to my DNA test. Ruth had dodgy DNA. Remember, she's a Moabite. She had incestuous DNA. Jesus shared her DNA because Ruth gives birth to Obed, the father of Jesse, the father of David. Mary, the physical, biological mother of Jesus, also descended from David. If Jesus had swabbed the inside of his cheek, not that he'd need to, he's the Son of God, and sent his DNA to a lab in Denmark, it would come back with a certain percentage labeled Moabite. So friend, as it turns out, wherever you find yourself now, Jesus is mighty to save, mighty to redeem your past. He stitched together your DNA, whatever it looks like, on purpose, for the purpose of bearing future fruit. 3CI, solid ground, friends online. Let's keep on keeping on, abiding in the true vine, staying tender, staying flexible so we can bear fruit and produce the oxygen that changes the atmosphere for his kingdom and glory. God bless you.